All right, we are back. This is the South Shore Sports Show. I'm Jason Snow with Chris McDaniel and Ryan Vermette. And guys, we're one step closer to the Super Bowl. We're now in the semifinal round. I believe we have 9 South Shore teams remaining in the hunt for a Super Bowl championship. Lots of highlights to recap.
Yeah, definitely. I think, pretty early on in the season, we were looking at it and saying there's going to be a lot of depth on South Shore football this year. As we were trying to do the top 10 rankings, there was a couple weeks we even expanded it to 15 teams because it was just too difficult to narrow it down to 10 teams. And having 9 teams in the semifinal, I think is just kind of a sign of that depth. But looking back at last week, I think, every South Shore team that was playing outside of playing another South Shore team, like, Archie's at Hanover was the higher seed and they were the home team. So, inevitably when you have that many kind of home teams that are the higher seeds, there's going to be a little bit of upset magic. And West Bridgewater, Abington, and Hingham all were upset last week at home. Um, some of those maybe not the shocking upsets that are super surprising, but those teams all had really good seasons, and we had pretty high expectations, especially for West Bridgewater and Abington. And I don't think this is a failure to bow this early in the tournament. Abington fell to Bishop Fenwick in a tough game, and West Bridgewater lost to Clinton, another team that seems to always make noise in the playoffs. Ryan, you were at the Abington game. What would you feel like was the difference there? I know there was a key play right before halftime that kind of swung the game a little bit.
Yeah, to me, being on the sideline, it was that key play right at the end of half. Bishop Fenwick launched a Hail Mary into the end zone. The ball came up about 5 yards short of the end zone, but it was tipped by a player in the Green Wave secondary, and then it fell into the hands of Fenwick. And they reached over to the goal line for kind of a crazy touchdown right before half. And the reason why was kind of the pivotal play in the game. Obviously, it was a momentum swinger, but that allowed Fenwick to take a double, a 2-score lead into halftime, 21-7. By halfway through the fourth quarter, Abington was down 2 scores. They were down 10 points. Without that touchdown, it becomes a 1-possession game. It might allow Abington to kind of play the offensive style they have been all year, which is that that potent run game that they've had all season, but being down 2 scores with I think just under 6 minutes to play, they had to kind of pass a little bit more than they wanted to, and that wasn't the only reason. Fenwick obviously being the lower seed, they were up against a tough challenge in Abington, who we thought might get to the Super Bowl, but Bishop Fenwick, they're just a really strongly coached team every year. They're always a solid team and always a potential to pull up the upset as they did on Friday. And I mean, it really, it didn't come down to just that Hail Mary at the end of the half, but it was a big part of it, kind of getting that momentum back at halftime.
Looking at West Bridgewater, that's a team that has probably had one of the best offenses in the area all season long, and Clinton just had a really good game plan to kind of shut them down. They held them to 6 points, which I definitely didn't expect to see in a West Bridgewater game at all this year, just based on how productive that offense was. I think they were over 40 points for the entire season for their average. Hingham, another team that fell upset to Malden Catholic. Last week Malden Catholic, the number 12 seed, beat Marshfield. This week they went to Hingham and won on the road there. Jason, you were talking about it, I think earlier in this postseason, but when you see a team that plays their schedule in Division III, hailing from the Catholic Conference, they're not the typical 12 seed you're going to run into.
Nah, absolutely not. We mentioned this last week. The final month of their schedule was CM. They had St. John's Prep. They had BC High, and then they had Xaverian. Um, and off the top of my head, I believe most of those were defeats, but nonetheless, you get that playoff feel a month earlier than everyone else, and it kind of prepares you for some of these high pressure games. And Malden Catholic controlled 2 games against 2 of the better South Shore teams that we have, in shutting down 2 offenses. We know in Hingham and Marshfield's always capable offensively. Malden Catholic has been one of the most impressive teams, pound for pound, in the state tournament.
Yeah, I don't think it's a total shock that there's 2 private schools pulling off these upsets. If you look at the bracket, the 2 lowest seeded teams remaining are number 12 Malden Catholic, number 7 Bishop Fenwick. North Attleboro in Division III is also alive as a number 7 seed. I was kind of looking through the brackets, and I think in divisions 1 through 7, Catholic school or private schools are 13-2 against public schools. So it feels like, and I think 4 of those games were upsets too. So it's not just teams that are the higher seeds are, winning the games they're expected to win. I think, Malden Catholic, those are 2 games that I think is a little bit surprising. But, in retrospect, maybe it's not as surprising as it was, if we had looked at if we had gotten a sneak peek at what the bracket's going to look like in 2 weeks when they first came out. I think we would have been surprised to see Malden Catholic there. But now seeing how those 2 games played out and looking back at their schedule, I think it's a little bit less surprising. So I don't know. I just thought those were some interesting numbers there, and I know that right around this time, and typically right after that Division II Super Bowl at Gillette Stadium, there's usually a conversation that sparks up about this subject, which potentially could happen this year. But maybe there's a team who we know a lot about that can maybe change that. But there's another Catholic school in the way of that one. I'm not gonna. Hinting strongly at somebody, but I'm not going to call them out by name specifically. But looking at these first 2 weeks of playoffs, I think, with 9 teams left, obviously, a lot of the area teams have been really impressive in different ways. And there's a lot of different ways you can kind of answer this question. But who do you guys think has been the most impressive team from the area so far, and just in the playoffs? Like I said, there's a couple different ways you can look at it. You can look at it like Norwell, Cohasset, and Randolph have just kind of dominated their opponents. But, I don't know if they've had that big test, that game where we didn't expect them to dominate and they dominated. I think they've kind of, matched expectations so far. You have Milton, which is, seems like their offense has taken it to another level. Archie's has probably the best 2 wins of anybody in the area in the playoffs. And, probably outside of Malden Catholic, potentially the 2 best wins of any team in the state tournament so far. Then you've got Duxbury, who's really turned it on after some midseason struggles, and Bridgewater-Raynham has, I think Friday was one of the best wins I saw last week, the 28-7 over Bill Ricca. So Ryan, I'll start with you. Who's kind of the team that's impressed you the most in the playoffs?
Yeah, it's tough because you mentioned teams like Duxbury who kind of had some bumps in the road in the middle of their season, and then all of a sudden they're back to playing Scituate. Who would have saw that coming, right? But being sarcastic there, of course. But yeah, I think it's Bridgewater-Raynham. I know they're the 3 seed. I know they've kind of been one of the favorites to get to the Super Bowl since the end of the season here. But I think earlier this season we talked about how they kind of came into the season after losing a couple close games and then, seeming to build off that, early this season. But I think we were all kind of wondering, okay, can they take all these close wins or, some of these close wins and losses and kind of take that into a playoff run where they're kind of, taking those lessons that they learned from earlier this year. And so far they have. They've won, both of their playoff games by double-digit scores, I believe. And I think they're going to match up well with the Bishop Feehan team that, I'll talk about that later when we talk about which games we're looking forward to this week. But yeah, for me, it's Bridgewater-Raynham. I think just building off of last year and not having the momentum slow down. And like I already mentioned, just the fact that they, kind of took everything that they've learned over these last 2 seasons and really put it together for a Final Four run.
Where would you rank Jack Lambert among the area's quarterbacks? Because it seems like every week he's got 3 or 4 passing touchdowns, and I think what makes him dangerous is it's usually 2 or 3 different guys he's finding in the end zone. It's not just that number 1 receiver that he's feeding all game. They really spread the ball around over there in BR.
Yeah, I mean, he's right up there. I mean, I think when you talk about a good quarterback, you talk about, I mean, obviously there's a number of quarterbacks on the South Shore, right, that are super dual threats or even just a big running threat every game. He doesn't put up crazy rushing totals, but you see his passing numbers. You said he's got multi-touchdown. It seems like he has multi-touchdown games almost every week, and then every other week he might be throwing for 3 or 4. So I think just he seems like a true pocket passer there for the Trojans. And you mentioned this is the other sign of a good quarterback is his ability to spread the ball around and elevate the talent around him. Obviously he's got senior Dylan Reed who's been kind of a safety blanket for him out of the slot there, but it does seem like it's a different receiver almost every week for Bridgewater-Raynham. And to me, that signifies how much he's kind of elevating that offense, and he's not looking for just one guy that's able to get open every week. He's really able to spread the ball around and make it difficult for the defense, to defend the full field. So, I mean, for me, he's right up there. Ian Baden said it last year after Lambert, was starting for his first season as a junior. He said, I think he's one of the best quarterbacks in the region. So I'll definitely put him up there in that, top 5, top 3 conversation for sure.
Another name that's kind of jumps out for BR in the playoffs is Adrian Peebles. He's kind of come out of nowhere a little bit to really be a kind of a featured back for them, and it just gives seems like balance is kind of the key for BR when they're able to kind of run the ball and pass the ball. They're probably one of the toughest teams in the area to beat. So I think his kind of ascension as a junior and a nice piece that they can probably build around next season as well, I think has kind of been one of the kind of a little bit under the radar storylines of the postseason so far. Jason, who's kind of jumped out to you as most impressive so far during these first 2 weeks of the playoffs?
There's so many good choices. I mean, if you want to go the underdog route, obviously Archbishop Williams, we've talked about him all season long. That Hanover win last week on the road, 28-26. Hudson Garrity, 4 touchdown passes was, a sensational accomplishment. But maybe I saw him in person a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to lean that way is Milton. I'm going to go with Milton in Division 3. You might look at them and go like, okay, they're a number 3 seed in the Final Four. That makes sense. But just the way that they've done it, they beat up on Reading Memorial in the opener, pretty good. That's the game I covered. The offense was clicking on full cylinder, and then last week you look at that Masconomet game and you're like, okay, this is one of the toughest games that they've had this season. Despite they played Natick and won, they had Weymouth on the schedule. So you look at that Masconomet game and you look at it and they're like, oh wait, they scored 40 again. And this Milton offense seemingly can put 40 up on almost anyone they share the field with. I'm really looking forward to see how this North Attleboro game goes this upcoming week. North Attleboro is a 7 seed, but they just put up 42 in an upset win against Barnstable last week. So I'm going to go with Milton. I'm going to give a shout out to Patrick Collins and Ronan Salmon, Dylan Raffle making big plays at outside linebacker. They can put pressure on the opposing quarterback, but this is an offense that is as high flying as any that we have.
For me, I'm going to go with kind of a familiar name here, and that's Duxbury. And I think what's kind of surprising about this is a month ago, I think we were kind of like, maybe Duxbury just doesn't have it this year. You can't be in the semifinals every single year, but apparently you can just based on the way that Duxbury's been playing. But in the first round, they beat a tough Holliston team in a 4-13 matchup, 39-12, and then Burlington was an undefeated number 5 seed. I didn't look at a lot of the kind of the prognostications and the prediction columns for the week, but I imagine a lot of people would look at that and say Burlington's undefeated, Duxbury isn't quite used to the Duxbury that maybe we've seen in recent years, and Duxbury beat them 38-14. Brady Ryan-Smith, I think he's got 8 passing touchdowns in the last 2 games. I think that offense kind of struggled a little bit, in the middle of the season, and now they're scoring 40 points a game and they're airing it out. And I don't think a month ago I would have looked at this potential Scituate Duxbury game and thought that Duxbury had a chance, but I feel very differently about it now than I did, a month ago. For me, it's Duxbury that's been the most impressive. Jason, you touched on Archie's. I think, when I've looked at the Archbishop Williams season, I feel like we kept looking at these. We kept looking at the next game and saying, well, if they look pretty good in that one, that means they're legit. So, I think the first one was the Ashland win, and Ashland went to the second round of the playoffs in Division 4. And Archie's beat them. And then I think we looked at the Fenwick game as another one of like, Fenwick's always good if they can beat them. And Archie's, really took care of them in that one. And then it was Swampscott in the first round and it was Hanover in the second round. So, I said it earlier, but I think Archie's has the 2 best wins of any South Shore team so far in the playoffs. And, I think when the bracket came out, that's kind of one of the things that we looked at is, Archie's might be really good, but they're going to have one of the toughest roads to a potential Super Bowl. And Foxborough this week is, potentially the toughest game for anyone in that Division 5 bracket. So that's going to be that's going to be a really fun matchup to watch. But anybody else that you guys want to kind of dive a little bit deeper on here that maybe we didn't hit as much? I feel like Norwell and Cohasset are two teams, and Randolph too are three teams that we haven't really talked about because I think we kind of you can never pencil a team in for the state semifinals, but I think we looked at their matchups and we said they've got a nice road here. But I think for all three teams, it certainly gets a lot tougher this week.
Yeah, I agree. But if I were to give a third place, so to speak, in my answer, I want to give a little bit of a shout out to Scituate because when you're starting your star running back is on crutches 3 weeks ago, and they still win that high level regular season finale against Hanover nonetheless without him. He comes back and they haven't missed a beat. Now I'm not a doctor. I don't know how severe the injury was. But for that team to keep the ship afloat, pun intended, because of the sailors, to keep that ship afloat despite some of that late season adversity is just speaks to how well rounded that team has come to be under Herb Devine and Division IV champs. They haven't missed a beat. So looking forward to that matchup this week. And Duxbury has a little bit more life than they did a few weeks ago, as you said, Chris, and so does Scituate. They beat Walpole. I believe it was a closer game than the seeds would reflect. I think it was 34-28, if I recall. And Grayson Foley had over 400 yards and dominated the game. So we highlight Grayson all the time on this show, but everyone's making an impact for the Sailors.
Yeah, and we're gonna highlight him in a couple minutes here. But if I look at that kind of the Patriot Ledger Football Player of the Year conversation, and for me, it's kind of two names. I think probably the headliner is Grayson Foley, and then kind of the co-headliner is Jack Lucarelli at Norwell, who I think he's 36 yards away from 2,000 rushing yards this season, which is just an absurd number. It feels like every week you can kind of pencil him in for at least 180 yards and 3 touchdowns. And Jason, you've seen Norwell a couple of times. Why can't anybody stop him? It feels like there's no secret to what Norwell's going to try and do to you, but it seems like nobody can find a way to slow him down.
Nobody can slow him down, and nobody knows why. Like, nobody has a perfect game plan to strategize against him. He's physically built different. He's bigger than he's bigger than almost all running backs. He's bigger than most if not all quarterbacks. And he just bulldozes. He just powers ahead. And in high school football, one athlete with the help of a very good offensive line bolstered by Ridley McGillicuddy up the middle. He's Jack Lucarelli. I'm speechless. I'm stammering here, but that's just really the only answer is he's bigger and faster and stronger.
Yeah, and it's not just Jack Lucarelli. Colin Gerhardt had a couple touchdowns last week. There's been a couple other names that chimed in, but it just feels like every week, if you had a high school football fantasy team, Jack Lucarelli is one of the first guys you're taking in that draft. Sorry, I interrupted you there, Ryan. Where were you going to go?
No, I just think you know what I really think it is, Jason. I mean, you touched on it briefly, but I think it is just his body frame. I mean,
that's it.
Taking a snap as a quarterback. I feel like at least in high school in Massachusetts, you're not expecting the quarterback or the guy who's taking the snap to be someone who's super physical. Obviously a lot of guys can run here. You typically in high school feel like you need to be that sort of dual threat quarterback. But, you don't think they're going to take that many big hits. He looks forward to the contact, and I feel like teams just aren't ready when he hits you on the defensive front. I feel like they're not ready for the kind of impact that he has physically on a defender, and I think he just wears the defense down. So I really think what it is, Chris, is I don't think they're able to stop him at the line of scrimmage, a couple times maybe, but those hits add up throughout a game, and then he's just able to kind of keep bruising. And obviously it's those 5 offensive linemen for Norwell as well. I spoke with them after the game, and they love blocking for him. They love, they just look forward to it every single game. And I really think that is, the biggest contributor is teams just not being, you think you can be ready to tackle someone, but when it happens, you're like, oh man, this is a little harder than I thought. And he'll just wear a defense down throughout the game, and I think that's why he's so difficult to stop.
Jason, if you were one-on-one with Jack Lucarelli, you in the open field trying to tackle him, or you trying to get an offensive rebound against him? Where do you think you have a better chance?
Better chance? I mean, neither. Let's just say I'm much happier to cover him as a reporter than I am playing against him. Maybe with the height I'd go rebound, but there's no way either way. Chris, can I ask you a question about Foley real quick though?
Yep.
While it's on my mind here, as kind of the elder statesman on the podcast, you've been covering South Shore football since 2012, right?
Yep.
Lawson was our player of the year last year, Lawson Foley. Now Grayson has a good chance to win it this year. Have you ever had a brother tandem win it back-to-back years and kind of be in that conversation as two of the best players in consecutive years? Like, how rare is what we're watching here?
Yeah, I think there might have been a little bit of a gap, but if we go back a few years, Scituate High, Aiden and Keegan Sullivan. Aiden was the star quarterback. He was lighting it up. I think Keegan might have been a freshman. Was Aiden when Adrian was a senior? So I think there was a little bit more of a gap there. But Keegan was kind of a similar role to Grayson as kind of like the I don't really know what position he is, but just get him the ball and he'll figure it out. Kind of player. So those are the kind of the two brothers that come to mind when you think of kind of like that family passing down kind of like the mantle of best player in the area. But I think Grayson's got I think Grayson's having an even more impressive season than Lawson, which he was a name that we had circled in the preseason that we thought would be a big time player, but I don't think we envisioned this level of success. I mean, you can't predict 400 yards in a playoff game and 5 touchdowns, and it's kind of ho hum for him at this point because seems like he's done that 3 or 4 times already this year. But you're going back to Jack. You guys were talking about he's got rare size for a kid, and Ryan, you were kind of touching on this a little bit, but I think what separates Jack is his mentality. Like he's a football player. He embraces the contact, and I think there are some kids who just have a different level of physical and mental toughness that that can take you a really long way in high school football. And when you can find a kid who has the physical tools and kind of the stuff up top where he embraces the contact and he loves it, you're going to get a special football player like Jack has turned into. And he was a name. I think Jason, you might have been right about him. His very first game, his high school season, his freshman
right.
year. And I think it was pretty immediate that we knew like this is a name we're going to be writing about a lot. And I think we might be writing about him just as much in the winter too for the basketball team. So he's having a heck of a start to the season, and I think there's a little bit more to come still.
Yeah, I remember his first game. If I remember correctly, it was Colin McCarthy was scheduled to be the senior quarterback for Norwell. I believe this is 2023, if I remember correctly. John Willis was the coach, and I go to the game, and come to find out McCarthy had suffered a shoulder injury the week before. And so they're putting in this freshman. We'll see how it goes. Playbook is not exactly open 100%. We're going to, kind of keep the training wheels on. Let's see how it goes. No expectation. And he runs wild. And I'm like, oh, interesting. Little bookmark for the future. This is a kid that has definitely taken the reins, and I can't believe the player he's turned into. It's pretty remarkable to watch.
Yeah, and going back to last week, you were at Cohasset, and kind of going back to the Bridgewater-Raynham conversation of they're at their best when they're balanced, and a lot of your story was about if we look at Cohasset a couple of years ago, it feels like Mike Wildfire, the quarterback, was kind of like he was the offense a little bit, and they were a team that they had to throw for 250 yards and 3 touchdowns to be at their best. And now we've seen Gus Green, he probably belongs in that conversation with Jack Luca and Grayson Foley as well. But it's just the balance that they have that's made them just a different level of team this year. And there's a quote in there. I forget exactly what Peter Fanasu said, the Cohasset coach, but he said this might be the best team I've had, something along those lines. And they've had a lot of really good teams. So what kind of jumps out to you about Cohasset?
Yeah, that the last 5 minutes of our conversation, Gus Green's listening to it right now, going like, "Why isn't my name being mentioned at all in this conversation?" So, yeah, Gus Green, he's another kid that you show up to the field, you're kind of looking at the teams, the size of the teams. All right, that kid, I wonder if he's a lineman. I wonder what position. Who's that number 22 kid? Because is that is that Stephon Diggs out there? Like, who is this kid? Like, he's just built. You know what I mean? So, um, yeah, Gus Green is an electrifying player to watch. He just burst through the tackles, and credit to the Cohasset offensive line led by Dan Baker up front, who Baker also makes perhaps an even bigger impact on defense. But yeah, this is a Cohasset team that Pete told me if they ramp up to their peak physicality, and trust me, they like to do that. This is one of the best teams that he's had in 20 years. And, uh, the rest of the teams in Division 7 don't want to hear that. Uh, but in my opinion, it's the truth as well. This is a Cohasset team that can take over games when they're at their peak physicality and when they're imposing their will. They have a lot of good balance too. Max Monahan had a pick six. Nolan Flaherty had a touchdown catch from Wildfire in that last game against Rockland, and this is a Cohasset team that's as dangerous as they come.
I look at that matchup against Northbridge, and Northbridge is one of those teams. Cohasset and Northbridge are two teams that you look at this Division 7 bracket every year, and you're kind of like, you got to find where they are, because they're teams that you really expect to reach this stage, kind of no matter what. Northbridge with Ken LaChapelle is just kind of one of the state's legendary programs. So, I don't know if a semifinal can kind of fly under the radar at all, but when I look across the state, this is one of the ones that I'm like, this is one of those games that if you're in the area, this is one worth going to. A team that I don't think we've talked enough about this year, Ryan, is Randolph. And I think some of that is because when they lost at Gillette last year and we looked at all the pieces coming back, we were like, we kind of expect them to be where they are right now. I don't know if we expected undefeated season, first time for them to be league champs, and I think since the 80s, something like that. But what's been your impression of Randolph so far in this postseason, as they've kind of they've dominated their opponents, and I think coming into the tournament we felt they were a little bit underseeded as the 4 seed, especially given the strength of schedule they played, and now they're going to be playing that number 1 team in the Neshoba Valley Tech in a rematch of last year's semifinal.
Yeah, I think it's about exactly what we expected, right? I mean, we kind of called this after the Super Bowl loss. We said with all the returning talent that they have, I feel like they're definitely well equipped to get back into this position this year, and I'm not surprised by it at all. I think the only surprise would be maybe them getting that 4th seed. I think maybe we expect them to be a couple seeds higher, and we know they got up to number 1 at one point this season. After there were a number of teams that held on to that position throughout the season, but. I mean, you look at what Mekhi White's done. We talk about all these runners, but I think at the Division 8 level, he's right out there with everyone. He deserves to be mentioned in that top runners in the area. But then you look at what Abe Cornett's done. I mean, last year they were obviously very run heavy, still are, but he's been able to provide an extra layer in that offense with a little bit of a passing game too. So he's not putting up some gaudy numbers. Like a Patrick Collins with Milton, right, throwing for over 300 yards in that last playoff game over Masco, but he's added a little bit more of an element to that game where you kind of have to defend the pass a little bit more, not thinking about it every play, as there's still, a run first team with White in that backfield, but he's kind of added that extra attack, for Randolph. So I think it's given them another layer, like I mentioned, to maybe make a run here in the show, but they beat him last year. I don't see any reason why, they wouldn't be able to pull off, I guess, a quote-unquote mini upset here. But, yeah, I mean, there's not much to it. I think it's exactly about what I've expected from them so far.
Yeah, and you mentioned Abe Cornett is a really good field general for them. Mekhi White is, kind of similar. Jack Lucarelli, he's a name that has kind of been on the radar for a while. And Alan Nariska has, I think, been a little bit of a breakout. He's been a name that was making a big impact for Randolph in recent years, but it seems like, especially on the offensive end, he's kind of taking his game to another level. And it's not just Mekhi White that you need to stop when you're playing Randolph. You got to slow down Abe, you got to slow down Allen. So that's a that's a more versatile attack than I think we're used to Randolph having in recent years. But as switching gears here, let's hand out some game balls. Jason, where you going with your game ball? It's a guy you know pretty well throughout the last year or so.
Yeah, I think I know him a little bit. His name is Hudson Garrity. For those who don't know him, can't imagine you don't. But the eighth grade quarterback from Archbishop Williams, 4 touchdown passes in perhaps the statement win of the weekend, 28-26 over Hanover in an upset. What a game for the area's youngest player, getting it done.
Ryan, where are you going to go with yours?
Yeah, I'm going. I just mentioned him, but I'm going Patrick Collins of Milton, throwing for over 300 yards and 4 touchdowns and a 41-27 win over Masconomet. I mean, it's not. This didn't feel like an empty, an empty 300-yard 4 touchdown game, right? Because Masco puts up 27. So and then Milton, responds by putting up 41. So it seemed like a gotta have it moment for him to keep that offense ahead of the opponent. I think it was just a really strong game, and it's anytime you could throw for 4 touchdowns and over 300 yards in a Massachusetts high school football playoff game, I think is pretty impressive.
Definitely. And I'm going to go with Grayson Foley out of Scituate. He led the Sailors to a 34-28 win over Walpole, 409 all-purpose yards, scored all 5 touchdowns. That includes a kick return, 3 rushes, a receiving touchdown. He ran for over 200. He had over 100 yards receiving. Like I said earlier, just get him the damn ball and let him work, and he's going to find a way. Yeah. And we'll kind of wrap it up here. I know we've kind of gone over all the games here, but I think everybody has one game that they're a little bit more looking forward to this week. Ryan, what's the game that kind of jumps out to you as your game of the week?
Yeah, it's Bridgewater-Raynham taking on Bishop Fee in the Division II state semifinal Final Four matchup there. It's the 3 seed versus the number 2 seed. I think it's one of the more premier matchups, in all the semifinals taking place across the 8 divisions. I just think these 2 teams are going to match up really well against each other. I think it's going to be close. I think Bridgewater-Raynham at this point, I don't think anything, I don't think anything is beyond them, in terms of getting to the Super Bowl. Obviously they gotta, think about this game ahead, but like I mentioned, this should be one of the top matchups, in the state. Really looking forward to it. It's, one of the closer matchups seed wise, obviously, just 1 seed in between there. So, I think it's going to be a premier game. It should come down right to the wire. I'm excited for it.
Yeah, I think when the brackets came out, it was kind of like you don't get a bye to the semifinal, but this was one, and I think everybody was kind of like, I can't wait to see that game. And I'm glad the matchup has played out, and here we are. I also like BR in this one. I just think that they're one of those teams really for the last 2 years. It feels like every week they're getting a little bit better. They're incrementally improving. And, I think they're playing their best right now, and they're going to need to be playing their best to take down a team like Fian. But I like BR in this one.
Yeah, I'll take them too. I didn't make my official pick. Kind of forgot to do that after the end of my spiel there. But I'll take the Trojans. I think they've been playing really well as of late. I don't think it's gonna be, I think their streak of winning these playoff games by multiple touchdowns might come to an end here. But I think they pull it off.
Yeah, you don't allow 7 points in 2 playoff games by accident. This is a Trojan defense that I don't know. We've talked a lot about Lambert and the offense and how great they've looked, but that defense is putting it together too. Cover your ears, Fian fans. I'm going with BR here in the clean sweep, and I'm going to predict the Trojans make it to their first Super Bowl, if I'm not mistaken, here since 2010, which would be a great accomplishment for the program.
Yeah, and year 2 for Coach Ian Bain. The program is clearly rowing in the right direction. And I don't think this is a 1 year kind of one hit wonder. I think this is kind of the new standard for BR, where quarterfinal, semifinals is kind of the expectation here. And I think this is a group that's really raised what the level for BR football is going forward. For my game of the week, I'm going to drop down 1 division. I'm going to go down to Division III. This was kind of the bracket that we talked about a ton coming into the playoffs, and it was because of matchups like this where, if you look at the numbers, Milton, North Attleboro's the 7 seed, Milton's the 3 seed. It doesn't seem like a super, appealing matchup seed wise, but like we said all along, Division 3 was a division that had probably 10 different teams that had a legitimate chance to make it to the Super Bowl. And North Attleboro is the defending state champs. They are not a 7 seed. I don't know how many different ways how many times I can say it. They took down number 2 Barnstable 42-21. So that says it all. They're coming from the Hockomock League, which I think outside of the Catholic Conference is probably the best league in the state this year. But on the other side, you have Milton, who they're scoring 41 points a game in the playoffs. Patrick Collins is throwing for 300 yards. There's so many different weapons you have to worry about with Ronan Salmon, Patrick Mason. They've had a couple different runners kind of come on these last couple weeks. Milton kind of took that 1-year hiatus last year where they were a little bit of a rebuilding year. They had a kind of funky end to the season, but that is not happening this year. They're playing their best, and kind of similar to what I said about BR. It seems like every week they get a little bit better, but this is kind of, this might be one of the games of the year for me when I look at the potential matchups. I don't really know how this one is going to play out, but I know it's going to be fun. I'm going to go with Milton just because I like the way that they're playing right now, but North Attleboro is a heck of a team on the other side there.
Yeah,
you got it right.
You said it best. You might as well scratch that 7, off of North Attleboro here. I mean, a team with championship pedigree, obviously winning it last year. This is a don't play with your food situation for Milton. Just get the win. Doesn't matter how it happens and advance to the Super Bowl. I think I'm going to take Milton here just because you mentioned, Chris, the way that they've been playing. I just feel like they've been so sound all season long. I don't expect that to end here. Obviously, anything could happen with a team that's previously won a championship as recently as last year. But I just think Milton has been so sound all year, and I don't see them getting tripped up here in the semifinal.
Yeah, one of the keys I'm looking for is how Milton can stop the run. North Attleboro brings up a lot of size up front. Their back, Frankie Strahan, is one of the bigger backs in the area. He can definitely impose his will between the tackles. I'd be interested to see how Milton can oppose that. Maybe it's just because I saw the game against Weymouth and how they were able to run the ball. Maybe North Attleboro can exploit some of the same things that Weymouth did. But that being said, you can't argue against the Wildcats right now, and that win against Natick turned a lot of heads in the state. As kind of a quote unquote surprising score considering D1, D3, and how well Natick was playing at the time and through the late stage of the season. But yeah, I'm going to rock with Milton here. I'm going to predict they get back to the Super Bowl for the first time in 2 years. They beat Walpole 2 years ago, missed it last year, and I'm going to say they're back.
Yeah, I think it's a little dangerous for us to go a clean sweep in that game, but I think we're all essentially saying this is a 50-50 game, and
yeah,
I would just like Milton a little bit more right now. And that's the type of game where I could see a lot of lead changes, a lot of momentum swings. I could see somebody getting up by 14 and then being down by 10. I could see one of those kind of crazy games playing out like that.
That's how the Walpole Super Bowl went. If you remember, 2 years ago, Walpole got up 2 scores, Milton came right back, and it wasn't exactly a close game down the stretch.
Yep, no, they really ran away with that one in the second half, and I think a lot of when we were in the press box, kind of thinking, oh no, is Milton going to have another great team that just comes a little bit short? And I think that game kind of flipped the trajectory of obviously that game, but I think where Milton is as a program too, and kind of the statewide conversation. But Jason, I think for your game of the week is kind of probably all of our. If we could only pick one game, I think this would probably be the game.
It's the double local, right? If you're a South Shore football fan, I expect you to be there. Duxbury versus Scituate. Usually we find ourselves watching this game at Gillette Stadium, but this time it's going to be at Hingham High. And, Scituate won the regular season matchup pretty handily, in Duxbury's house, and I was there for that one, so maybe that colors my pick a little bit here. But, we talked about it earlier. Duxbury it felt, that Scituate regular season matchup wasn't week 2. So you got to give Duxbury a little grace, to a little time to figure, they had a lot of changes in the offseason, lots of graduation. They have a new quarterback, a lot of new moving pieces. So it took them a little bit, a few weeks to really figure things out. And now they're kind of in that regular Duxbury groove of really outlasting opponents and taking control of games. That being said, it's hard to go against Scituate here. But it's going to be a much, much closer game than that week 2 matchup was. I know we don't do scores on here, but maybe a 35-28 Scituate wins it on a late touchdown. I think it's going to be that type of game.
How are you feeling, Ryan?
Yeah, before the season, I posted on our website a handful of predictions in a story, on the Patriot Ledger website, and one of them being, Super Bowl prediction of thinking these two teams were going to meet, again in the Super Bowl. I was a game short of that, still meeting in the semifinals, so I was close on that one. But yeah, I mean, it's so hard to pick against what Scituate's doing and what Foley is doing back there for them. The way Duxbury is playing, Jason, like you said, I think it's going to be closer. And this rivalry is starting to get that Bills-Chiefs feel to it, right? They're meeting every year in the playoffs, or, in the regular season. The games are crazy, too, when they do meet. I feel like in a season where there's been a little bit less chalk than usual, still a lot of favorites obviously advancing, but I feel like this would be as good of any year to pick Duxbury upsetting Scituate. I'll go with the Dragons. Gotta shake things up somewhere, and I'll take Duxbury the way they've been playing, the way their passing attack has been playing. This might be a game where, if you hold Foley to 200 yards versus 400 yards, you might have a shot. I know that sounds ludicrous, but that's where we are with Scituate. So maybe if they can hold them in check, big air quotes there, maybe they can get it done. So I'm going to go with Duxbury. Let's have a little fun here.
Yeah, around these parts, Ryan, we say that the Bills Chiefs is starting to feel like Duxbury Scituate. It's not the other way around. But looking at this game, I'm also going to go with Duxbury, which I think is a little bit of a surprise that the panel is leaning towards Duxbury here. But I was saying it earlier. I just really like the way the Duxbury's playing right now, and that's not to take anything away from the way the Scituate's playing. They're playing. You beat Walpole in the postseason. That's one of the toughest wins that you can get. But it just feels like Duxbury has kind of hit the reset button since that midseason struggle. Brady Rhinesmith and Grayson Foley. They might be who's playing better than those two kids right now heading into the state semifinal. So it's going to be a heck of a matchup, and whoever wins this one is, this is probably the win of the year for whoever comes out on top of this one. A game that we haven't really talked much about is on the other side of this bracket. Number 3, Canton playing number 2, Tewksbury. Canton hails from that loaded Hockomock League. There's probably, I don't know if there's a team in Division 4 that's been more tested than Canton. Tewksbury, though, I think was, if you had to pick one favorite in this division, it was probably Tewksbury because of some of their big wins. They went undefeated. They've probably been the most dominant team in the bracket. What are you feeling about this matchup, Jason? Because Tewksbury comes in, they beat Middleborough 49-7 in the first round, and then they beat Ashland, a good Ashland team, 34-7 in the second round, where Canton has been a little bit more dicey, 35-22 over Wakefield in the first round, and then they had control of the game against Marblehead, but they kind of had to hold on to it late a little bit, 27-22. So what's your kind of feeling for this one? Because we haven't delved too deep into this one.
Yeah, Tewksbury has been the much more dominant team. But then again, you look at Canton's schedule and you see a lot of heavy hitters on it. You see North Attleboro on it. You see Foxborough on it. You see Mansfield on it. And that's this is a Canton team that has gone through, arguably the toughest league in the state. And, this is a Canton team that's riding 4 straight victories, some of them closer than you'd want them to be. I think if Canton were to win, it'd be considered an upset, all things considered. But I kind of like their chances to keep it closer than anyone else has against Tewksbury. I think the key for Canton's going to try to keep it, in the low 20s, mid-20s, at the most. Can that defense hold Tewksbury to that point total? I just don't know if I see a Canton team getting to that 30, 35 points to really, outscore and, keep pace. Can they muck the game up? Can they get an early score and kind of control it with the defense? I think those are going to be the keys for Canton. And I don't have it offhand, Chris. Maybe you know it just off the top of your head, but I don't know the last time Canton's made the Super Bowl. So nonetheless, to make it this far is an accomplishment nonetheless, however you slice it. I like Canton to keep it close.
Yeah, and just to kind of explain a little bit what Tewksbury's done this year, they're 10-0. Some of their kind of marquee wins, they beat Methuen 28-6. They beat Lowell 25-21. They beat Billerica 35-0. They beat North Andover 42-7. They beat Andover 41-14. They've only had one score game all season. That was the Lowell game back in September. So they've been a team that's been able to score a lot of points and not give up a lot of points. So, I think this is going to be one of the most physical games of the weekend. I think, this could be one of those games that's, 13-7 heading into the fourth quarter, and there's been 12 punts already, and a lot of cramps in the fourth quarter, that sort of thing. I think it's going to be a physically exhausting game, and I think Canton might need a return, a fumble deep in the opponent's territory, something like that to kind of flip it. But if Canton's up early, that's a game that can very easily kind of swing their way. And one of the things I think I always worry about with some of those teams that have been really dominant all season is what happens when they get punched in the mouth and it's 14-3 and they just had a punt again. How are they going to react to that? And I think that's something that we've talked a little bit about with Archbishop Williams all season long is they haven't really been here before. They haven't been in these big games. They haven't had this success. They haven't dealt with this stage, and how are they going to respond to it? And they responded to it well every time, but you still never know when you have a team like Tewksbury who it's been a while since they've it was fingernail biting time in the fourth quarter for them. So it's going to be, if Canton can make that a game, Canton's been in those games all season long, pretty much every week. And so they're going to be comfortable in that spot. So I think that's the key. If it can be a close game in the fourth quarter, it leans kind of heavily to Canton.
I agree.
Awesome. So, the next time we meet here, we'll be talking about Thanksgiving football and looking ahead to Gillette. So, I think we all can agree here that this is the best time of the high school football season, and we can't wait to see how these games shake out. But I think there's gonna be a heavy South Shore contingent at Gillette Stadium in a couple of weeks.